I saw that you, Michelle, put out a statement in support of the Iranian protesters earlier this week. I was just wondering why you thought it was important to weigh in, and if you think there's lessons we can learn from the Green Movement in 2009 or the Arab Spring about which of these democratic movements succeed and fail, and why.
I think there's no way to predict how this plays out. And one thing we all learned through the Arab Spring, the Green Movement in Iran and a lot of other places, is that you can't underestimate the power of just sheer force and violence, sadly, and the repressive mechanisms that a government like Iran has in place. But there are a couple of conclusions we can draw from. Number one is that there is deep dissatisfaction with the Iranian regime. Number two, that women in particular are chafing under a series of not just systematic discrimination against women and subjugation of women, but also an arbitrariness and cruelty beneath that's exercised by the state against women, which has made them essentially say, we're fed up, we're tired of this. And that's extraordinarily powerful. Whether it ends up bringing about fundamental change in that regime, I think is hard to predict. But the one thing that, when I think back to 2009, 2010, you guys will recall, there was a big debate inside the White House about whether I should publicly affirm what was going on with the Green Movement, because a lot of the activists were being accused of being tools of the West, and there was some thought that we were somehow going to be undermining their street cred in Iran if I supported what they were doing. And in retrospect, I think that was a mistake. Every time we see a flash, a glimmer of hope, of people longing for freedom, I think we have to point it out. We have to shine a spotlight on it. We have to express some solidarity about it. That doesn't mean, by the way, that the administration is that a U.S. administration shouldn't be taking in a bunch of other equities into account. They have to. A president has to, right? So I continue to believe that the Iran nuclear deal was a really important thing for us to do to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Had we not had that in place, I think Iran would have had a nuclear weapon by now.
Well, look how well it's gone since we pulled out.
Exactly, right? So you still have to make decisions, often very difficult, about are there places where you do business with a government that is repressive? And that's the job of a president and an administration facing a complicated world. But our moral response to the incredible courage that is taking place in Iran and those women and girls who are on the streets knowing that they're putting themselves in harm's way to speak truth to power. We have to affirm what they do and hope that it brings about more space for the kind of civic conversation that over time can take that country down a better path.
Speaking of brutal, repressive governments, I mean, it's been 9 months since Putin launched this invasion of Ukraine. Right. I think everyone's been impressed with the way the Ukrainians have fought, how effectively they fought. I've been impressed with how much Europe has actually stepped up and supported them. The flip side of that success, though, is the fact that it appears that Russia is losing, or at least losing ground. Putin is getting pushed further into the corner. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts for people who are watching this. They're inspired by the Ukrainian resistance. They want them to defend their country successfully, but they're also pretty nervous about continued escalation and this chatter about, Russia using a nuclear weapon.
I think what the Ukrainian people have accomplished is extraordinary. And it's a testimony to not just the courage of a few soldiers, but this is a entire nation mobilizing in the face of extraordinary odds, and making tremendous sacrifices. And Zelensky himself has risen to the moment in a way that his biography would not have necessarily anticipated. Right. So at the end of the day, it is not our job to tell the Ukrainians when is it enough, how far should they go, what concessions should they make, et cetera. That's up to them. As their allies, it is important for us to support them financially, militarily, through our intelligence. We do have, however, to be clear and honest with them about what we can and cannot do. And there are lines that we have to determine internally, the U.S., NATO, and others, that take into account the risk of this tipping into a Russia-U.S.-NATO conflict as opposed to a Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'm not privy to enough of the intelligence at this stage and it's not my job as a private citizen to weigh in on where that line should be drawn. But as we're thinking about, for example, what weapons we're sending in or how we're approaching our support for Ukraine, I think thinking about where defense stops and offense begins and how we manage that is something that we have to pay attention to. And I do think, probably the thing that I'm most concerned about is that lines of communication between the White House and the Kremlin are probably as weak as they have been in a very long time. Yeah. Even in the in some of the lowest points of the Cold War, there was still a sense of the ability to pick up a phone and work through diplomatic channels to send clear signals. And a lot of that is broken down, and I don't think it's the fault of our administration. I think that we're now dealing with a type of Russian regime that is actually even more centralized, even more isolated and closed off. I think Putin has consolidated decision-making to a degree that we haven't seen, even during the Soviet era. And that, I think, creates some dangers, and us finding ways in which some of that communication can be reestablished, I think, would be important.